Hebe Schaefer, who we wave, although your name's probably there so people see you. She's a licensed clinical social worker with over 10 years of experience at Great Oaks Legacy Charter School, where she provides counseling support to students and their families. Prior to GOLCS, she worked in a variety of school settings, community-based mental health organizations, and hospitals, and she's trained in restorative practices and complex trauma. She is cheerful, passionate, and blessed to love the work she does. I love that at the end of your bio. We are also very pleased to have with us Tanya Lewis. I don't see her on my screen. There she is, okay. Who we've been working with for a number of years. Tanya is an independent consultant to nonprofit and public sector institutions with a particular interest in working with institutions that serve under-resourced communities and Black and Brown children. Tanya is a certified trainer in restorative practices, and her consulting practice focuses on creating authentic relationships that support a healthy culture and climate. Tanya's 30-plus year career includes working in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And this, nice to read this sentence because over the years of working with Tanya, we hear all the stages of her daughter's life. So it's fun to read now that she's a proud mother of an adult daughter who began her career during the pandemic as an elementary teacher at a charter school in Harlem. What a way to start your career. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you, thank you. And hello, good evening, everyone. I first want to say that it is an absolute pleasure to be here this evening talking about something that I care very deeply about. For those of you who've ever been to any of my trainings, you do know that restorative practices is something I was introduced to when my daughter was in 7th grade. And I became a practitioner of it because I needed some help. And I have fully embraced the concepts and used it at home, as well as learned enough about it to become a trainer and train school districts and individuals around the country. I think that this evening is particularly of interest to me is because it really does speak to my origination with restorative practices, which is how do you incorporate it into your home life? I have a PowerPoint that we're going to be talking to, not reading, but I will be sharing some stories as I typically do of mostly my daughter. But I might even share something of my ex-husband, not sure yet, we'll decide. But let's start with, if we could put up the PowerPoint, Russell. I'm sorry, I froze for a moment. Okay. So yes, you could just move to the next slide. So for many people, restorative practices is a term that is not foreign. We've heard it. You even hear it on TV sometimes in different TV shows. But there's a lot of people who really don't understand exactly what it is. We use the term a lot, but what exactly is it? And so I wanted to start by just explaining that restorative practices isn't new. It's really what we've always done when we wanted to build strong relationships within your home, in your neighborhood, on your block, and in schools. Restorative practices are really just strategies that we've always used, but now we're being more deliberate about it. And it is there for us to build healthy relationships that are based on trust. And I use the term social capital because as you build trust, you build social capital. And then what happens is that individuals are more willing to do things because they trust that you aren't going to lead them wrong and you're going to be fair. And so to understand restorative practices really means that you're understanding that the relationship is the core. It's about having relationships, building relationships, and repairing relationships. And the restoring is only restoring something that you actually have. Russell, if you don't mind. So, talking about discipline, which is really where restorative practices becomes the terminology people use a lot, is discipline has changed over the years. You know, there's been this paradigm shift of how we discipline our children. So it went from zero tolerance all the way to now the restorative approaches in schools and, but not necessarily at home. And so what happens is that there is a disconnect between what's now happening sometimes in a school setting to what's happening at home. And that's what happened in my situation. My daughter went to this wonderful school that taught her quite a bit about being independent in her thinking and her talking, and to challenge. And I am first generation American, grew up in a household where my parents did not encourage us to challenge. And I had to now figure out how I was going to work with what I was raised with and what was expected of my daughter. And restorative practices really did help me to figure out what would be the best way to make synergy. And part of it was understanding where they were coming from, and the other part was bringing it into the house and stretching myself so that I could possibly, make my daughter more successful in the space. Russell? So what restorative practices is really based on are values that you would want in pretty much any household, right? Any family. It's about inclusivity, building relationships, ensuring that everyone is heard. Now that was a big one for me and my family. Making sure that everyone is heard includes little kids. And that wasn't something that, traditionally had been done in my family. And I had to figure out how to reconcile that. Minimizing, stigmatizing shame. Discipline, oftentimes, as I was growing up, was shaming. That was how you disciplined, was to make somebody feel very badly about themselves. And so, that was another piece where I had to make some shifts in figuring out how I could be more effective and making sure my daughter understood what she had done was wrong without shaming her, and me still feeling like I was being authentic. And then there's always the path to coming back, to restoring that relationship. We know that we're going to love our kids no matter what, but sometimes they might not feel it if we've already said some things that were, difficult or for them to hear, or we didn't say it in a way that was most productive to a conversation. Russell?
Really quickly, Miss Lewis, Miss Schaefer, can you mute? I think we're experiencing a little bit of feedback. Thank you so much.
So the question becomes, how do you create restorative relationships in your home? The biggest piece is these 5 key things. Collaborating with problem solving. That means including them in the discussion of how we're going to fix something. Strengthening the relationships that you have with your children and them among each other. Focusing on not what they did to break the rule, but what was the harm that was done as a result of breaking the rule. When you get to that, then you also have to start reflecting on the rule, right? because if there's a rule, there should be a reason why there's a rule. And if you don't follow that rule, then there's some kind of harm that is done. So it makes you start to think a little bit harder about the rules that you're putting in place, because it's not just because I said so. Well, it could be, but hopefully it's not just because I said so, right? And then helping your children to identify their needs and assist them in finding out how they're going to be able to meet those needs. And then also making sure that your children understand that there is always going to be some conflict. That's never going to end. The issue is, how do you handle it in a productive way? And that's what restorative practices will be able to do in your home, as we're going to talk about a couple of different methods that you can use to address these very things. Russell? Okay. Hebe?
Sorry, yes. So hi, everyone. I am Hebe Schaefer, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you bring the conversations home. One thing I wanted to sort of build on from what Tanya was saying is that whole idea of shame being part of discipline. And I think one of the reasons, or one of the things that happens, shaming someone is fairly easy. You don't necessarily have to be specific about the why. We all know better than to say, "What's wrong with you?" Or, but shame comes more easily than expressing exactly how you feel, because sometimes in the moment, if something's occurred or harm has been done, we don't always know, both the adults or the children don't necessarily know exactly how they're feeling. And so I think it's really important to get to a place in conversations with our children and one another, of course, of understanding when that shame starts to come up, when that starts to be our first reaction, what's underlying it. So I think, to build on what Tanya was saying, a big piece of restorative practices, both at home and in school and in the world, is how we begin to understand our own emotions and identify and learn about ourselves, as well as then therefore, or thereby basically helping others understand their emotions as well. I mean, as a social worker in a school, I spend almost my entire day helping kids expand their emotional vocabulary, understanding more about feelings. And the same thing can go on at home. The other part that I thought really spoke to me when I first started doing restorative circles, as I did practice at home, was the idea that everyone listens and that everyone has a turn and everyone has a chance to tell their part of the story. One of the things I use a lot at work and at home too, but at work a lot, is, maybe there's been a little misunderstanding. Maybe what the child thought they were supposed to do, they misunderstood. And sometimes that allows that moment, both for the parent, the child, or the teacher and the child, or the principal and the child, to just take a moment and think about what happened, and then restoratively discuss what harm has been done. And so in that sense, table conversations, dinner conversations, they can be very restorative. And then in any type of restorative conversation, be it at home or in school or in the community, we always want to speak from our hearts and say just enough, but not too much. So the importance of that is also, I think, as parents and as teachers, we often are the person in power, and understanding your role as the person in power is also super important, but also respecting that role and not taking advantage of it. So therefore, being conscious of your feelings, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get towards a couple of slides in, like all the different feelings that we do have. But that's one of the ways you can bring that home. I think, Russell, the next slide Yeah, so I just brainstormed some dinner table prompts that one could use for different age groups. Sunshine makes me feel, or rain makes me feel. I know sometimes at dinner, we often, when we get the chance to eat dinner with our children, sometimes we're recapping school day, and sometimes that isn't always so fun for kids, especially if the day didn't go well or the game didn't go well. It's just more enjoyable for everyone to talk, and you'd be so surprised sometimes how children respond to questions. Name a person who makes you laugh. Anyone can answer that question. What is your favorite thing to do in school? Not so much like how did school go today, but what did you actually like about school today? For older kids, what do you like to collect? Are you interested in becoming a collector? What does being a collector mean? Or talk about your own things that you might collect. In our household, my husband has 1,500 albums, So, or give a thank you, a compliment, apology for something that happened. And as you know, maybe from hearing Tanya tell her stories, I think it's always really great to be able to give an example to a child when you've done something, that you've made a mistake, and how did you feel or deal with that? And so that whole idea of maybe sharing a time when you had to apologize. And again, these are, some basic ideas, but the importance of having that conversation around the dinner table or at breakfast or in the car. I mean, all of this can happen at any time when you're together with your kids. And then Tanya, yeah.
Ask one question.
Sure.
I had a girl. Have a girl. You have twin boys.
Yeah.
How did they respond to you doing these circles at the dinner table?
Well, it was interesting because I think I started doing Restorative about 5 years ago. So they were still home. They were in high school, and I found I used it actually to get through an argument. I actually did the restorative questions and such to get through an argument. And then after that, at the dinner table, they'd sort of be like, oh, come on, Mom. But then it really was fun. So it worked really well in the sense that it gave everybody a chance to be heard. And I think so often we think we're listening, but we're actually thinking about what the next thing you're going to say is, and you have to slow down a little bit with restorative. So it worked quite well. And the whole idea of giving a compliment that, they're boys, they're not that great at that. So we practiced that a lot. So it worked well when they were younger. And I think, something that I've talked with Tanya about, I was raised as a Quaker, and the Quaker religion is fairly restorative in its approach. And so it came sort of naturally to me, but that's not true for all of us. And certainly shame comes more naturally in certain cultures and groups. And I was really just touched by the fact that shame can be that easier emotion to get to, whereas frustration or hurt or other underlying feelings, even embarrassment, is more complex for an adult to talk about. So they really enjoyed it. Yeah. So Tanya, do you want to talk a little bit about the FAIR process, and then I'll jump back in?
Yeah. So as Hebe said, she used circles, and she used the restorative questions with her twin boys to resolve issues. It was just myself and my daughter at home. So we spent a lot of time working on how do we have open and honest communication where I was open enough to listen and not do what Hebe just said, which is listen to her to prepare my retort for why she's wrong and why we're going to do it the way I want to do it because I said so. And there were, we did it with baby steps until the point where it's just become innate with how we interact with each other. But fair process was a huge component in us getting over discipline issues or making big decisions, particularly when she was younger. I always share this story. So for those of you who know me, you've heard this particular story, and it had to do with my daughter wanting to get a horse. And so just to give some context, at this time we were living on Fifth Avenue in Harlem, and she was taking horseback riding lessons to help her with her anxiety. And so she went to a sleepaway camp in Connecticut, and the camp was so gracious enough to offer any of the campers who wanted it, they could take the horse home with them and keep it alive for the 10 months that camp isn't in session, which was so kind. And so now my daughter gives me this call saying, hey, Mom, we can get this horse for free. Because she knows one of my issues is, you know, how much is that going to cost? That's always what I ask. So my sweet daughter shows up saying, you know, I want to bring home a horse just like all my other friends. And why won't you let me bring a horse and it's free? And she was very upset. And so I used fair process as an opportunity for us to talk it through. So I'm going to explain the process, and then I'll show you how it worked in my life, right? So fair process is that it's the basic understanding that people want to be heard, and that means more to them than getting their own way, is to be heard. So what would have normally happened is I would have said, are you out of your mind? No, we're not getting a horse. Done. Now, she would not have felt heard. And what would have happened is that there would have been venting, resentment, silent treatment. And as I mentioned before, she deals with anxiety. It would have just escalated into a bigger crisis. So while my motivation wasn't necessarily, oh, I just want to, you know, I want to have an open communication with my daughter at the time. I'll be honest. My motivation was I need her to hear this conversation, understand it, and receive it without having migraines and getting sick and missing school. That was really my motivation at the time. I've since learned that actually it's a wonderful way to communicate, and my daughter and I are incredibly close as a result. But this was the first time I really utilized it. So Russell, you want to change the slide? It starts with engagement. And engagement really does mean truly engaging, listening. And listening even when whatever they're saying might not be something you actually agree with, but to hear them, give them the opportunity to share how they feel. And then you go on to explain what your concerns are. And then the expectation clarity is what's going to happen afterwards once we've come to a resolution. So in my example, the engagement was me explaining to my daughter that I'm sure you want to have a horse here, but we have to talk about how we keep a horse alive. So let's talk of all the things that are required. And so she then came up with a list of what the horse would need. We'd need a stable to rent for the horse to stay there. We would have to feed the horse. Who's going to feed the horse? All of that information. She went out. She prepared a PowerPoint. She presented to me where the closest stable was. She had a friend who also wanted to rent the same horse or foster the same horse. And so they said that, they could share the stable or something like that. But for some reason it didn't save her money by sharing the stable. It was, instead of it being $1,600 a month, it would be, $900 and $900. So the guy would make even more money. But it still was a lot of money. If you want to have a horse, and I don't know if any of you have horses, but you have to go there every day to feed it. And you have to go and clean the stable, and you have to do all of that. So we lived in Harlem. The stable was in Brooklyn. She was in 7th grade. How are we going to get there every day to feed the horse? She created as much of a spreadsheet as she could. She calculated how much it was going to cost. You had to have money aside because if something goes, you know, if the horse gets sick, you have to pay a big vet, you know, big animal vet fee, which is not the same as a cat, right? And so I had her research how much does that cost for a typical visit, because we need to have some money aside just in case, because we are responsible for this horse. How much does it cost to get the trailer to bring the horse from the camp back to Brooklyn and then back to the camp? So when she was all done, it came out to be about $10,000. And so she then tried really hard to figure out, well, how much money would she be getting for Christmas and her birthday to see if she could afford this $10,000 fee. And when we went over, well, how much did you get last year? And it was like about 300. It's like, well, that's a big difference. She was like, you know what? This is a scam. This horse isn't free. And so I didn't have to tell her this. She then came back to me saying, you know, this isn't a free horse. And I don't know what they were thinking, but how am I supposed to tell me it's a free horse and I have to come up with $10,000? And it was resolved, right? Now, if she had come up with $10,000, I had said, listen, if you can figure this out, I will support it. And I had to be willing to really support it. But it was such an easy conversation to have when she understood the explanation. She understood all the parameters as to the why. Because otherwise, I typically would have just said no. And I wouldn't have explained, this is how much it costs for this. This is how much it costs for that. I wouldn't have explained all that because it would have taken time. So all this conversation really cost me was time. And it cost her time as well to prepare this case of showing me the PowerPoint. But what happened in that experience and what happens with fair process is that through really having engagement, having true conversation, understanding where each person is coming from, and being clear on what we're going to do at the end, gives people the opportunity to feel heard and feel respected. And so she walked away from that experience not being angry with me, but understanding a little bit more about why I said I couldn't do it. And if she wants to get a horse, she understands what it will entail for her to get a horse. And she's welcome to do that at some point when she's ready. Russell? So what fair process actually achieves is that you start to build trust because you have the open conversation. And through that open communication, then people start to voluntarily cooperate, right? So she voluntarily said, okay, I think that, you know, getting this horse really wasn't the best idea. And then it also drives performance. And what that means really in my situation is she created a whole PowerPoint. She clearly understands what it takes. And she didn't just use this example and say, well, I now know what it takes to take care of a free horse. This was a learning opportunity for her to now know that when other people offer her things, she has to really investigate, what does that mean really? And what am I taking on when I say yes? So it went way beyond just that particular thing. And that was, in my experience, every time I've implemented fair process, she has grown from it, and so have I. We've used it years later with a tattoo. And that one, she got the tattoo. And I was able to be like, I'm good with that. And we were clear about why she was getting the tattoo, what it was about, and if we could just maintain the level of, and I'll just say she got a tattoo that says "Still I Rise" because it was so difficult for her to get through school. So by the time she graduated, it was such a big deal. And she wanted a tattoo to memorialize it. And it was something that before she had explained the reason why, I wasn't all that gung-ho about. Once I understood the reason why, I fully embraced it. I told my mother, and my mother is, you know, a pearl wearing, purse over her arm, very, very conservative lady. She loved it because of the reason behind it. And then the second tattoo was on her 21st birthday, and it's a combination of her she's a Virgo and I'm an Aries, and I got one too. So you see, it's right back here so nobody can see it, but I have one. And so just the experience itself, and that was again through fair process, but that time it was me changing and listening to her versus her changing. So fair process actually helps you to have these great conversations where usually you'd be butting heads. Hebe?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And Tanya, one of the things I love about those stories is the importance of allowing enough time for everyone to be heard. And I think sometimes, you know, taking that time to really reflect and allow the process to unfold, and being willing to engage and have an explanation or listen to an explanation is just so important. And I know all of us are working, you know, especially in the last 14 months, that time has, at least for me anyway, become a real warp. And so just allowing that time to be heard and to hear others is really what fair process as well as restorative is really about, being heard and taking the time to listen. So I had talked earlier just about the importance of identifying feelings. Just in the very beginning, we discussed how important it was to understand your own feelings first. And I just love this list of feelings. You know, children of any age are always expanding our understanding and their understanding of what emotions mean. And so I just included this as a way to remind us all that there's so many different ways. There's so many ways to feel joy. There's so many love words that are about expanding our understanding, you know, reminding us to be compassionate. You know, it's good to talk about anger words as well. I mean, I think that children really need our guidance and help in understanding their own emotions. And so being able to use different words to express ourselves is really important. So I think there's another slide too. Russell, maybe go ahead to the next one. So envy words, jealousy words, sadness words, fear words. These are just all different. I just love this, the idea that there's just so many different ways of looking at something, and that to remind us how important it is to be open to different emotions and willing to express our emotions with both our children and out in the world.
And can I just
yes, of course.
real
Yeah.
quick? The other thing that I think is worth mentioning to parents is sometimes you're going to hear things that are going to make you feel uncomfortable. Like when you know, my daughter has told me that I have made her feel small, or I have, you know, made her feel like her feelings don't matter. And when I hear those things, I have to take a deep breath and think about how I'm going to react. Because when I'm hurt, how do you react when you're hurt? You lash out, right? And so when she says those things, I get defensive, like, I'm the best mother that you could ever have. What are you talking about? You know, like, that's where I want to go. Rather than acknowledging, okay, I did that, and that's how it made me feel. That was not my intent. That's how I made you feel. And not take it personally, but hear her so that I can do what I need to do to make things right with her, rather than get defensive about, you unappreciative little child, do you know what I have done, right? Because that's exactly where I immediately want to go to. And I am not naturally restorative like Hebe. I'm not. It's a daily work for me. It's something I have to practice all the time. It's something that I have to fix often. But what I am is open to being transparent, and I'm open to being vulnerable. And because I'm open to that, I end up being fair. I will say when I messed up. And that's not, something that I grew up thinking that, parents don't tell their kids that they messed up because there's a dynamic there of authority. But what happened is when I was that vulnerable, what ended up happening is that my daughter felt like she could really, really trust me and started sharing more and more and more with me. And now I have a 23-year-old who calls me twice a day. That's a lot, but and shares, everything. Sometimes more than everything, or more than I want to know, rather. But that's because she knows that even when she tells me something that I don't like, what she's going to get from me is maybe me feeling sad about it, but not me lashing out back at her, right? Because I started to focus on these emotions and how I can keep my emotions in check when she shares hers with me. So does anyone have questions?
I'm going to jump in for just a second. For some reason, my camera is off, but I'm here.
Yeah. And everyone can, Lucas, a little quiet. Sorry, I've got my noise here. People can use the chat if they'd like for questions too. I know people are probably managing homes and bedtime like me. So feel free to use the chat for your questions too. We'll read them for you if you can't use your voice.
Tanya, it's Sheila Murphy. I know in the past when we've had trainings, you've focused on the difference between restorative practices and restorative justice. And I think Hebe talked a little bit tonight about the questions that she used at the table. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about that 80-20 distinction and where the questions fit in there.
Sure. So restorative justice is really just a small piece of what restorative practices is. Restorative practices is most of the things that we're talking about in the very beginning. It's building relationships. It's open communication. It's working to make sure that people feel heard. And it's making sure that as people are sharing information, they're doing it in a way that's respectful, right? Restorative justice really focuses on when things don't go well. So when somebody's done something that's harmed the other, right? So it can be siblings that are bickering and fighting. It can be a child who is not following the rules of the home. It could be that, your child talked back to a teacher. It could be anything where there was harm done. And then restorative justice is how do we address that harm and repair it? Those questions that Hebe mentioned, they are questions to get to the root of what happened. What were you thinking at that time? Who did you hurt or harm? What could you have done differently? How can you make it right? Those are the questions that you would ask, and it helps the child really be mindful of what was going on at the time without shaming them. And that is, one of the reasons that the question cards are so successful is when you're asking these questions, you're asking them as calmly as you can. Because you can ask what happened in a way that actually escalates, right? It's all about tone. So when you say, okay, so tell me what happened, you really are engaging them and wanting them to explain to you what happened from their point of view. And their point of view might be very different from your interpretation of what really happened, or, you know, what you believe happened, but you're now hearing their point of view and allowing them to share and share and share until they get it all out. Because what happens often is if we don't give them that opportunity, they get very frustrated and then they stop focusing on how to make things right. And all they're focusing on is how you're making me feel, not how I can fix whatever it is that I've done to someone else. And so restorative justice would focus on maybe those questions, fair process, you know, conferences. They're all different tools that you can use to address harm, address how someone has harmed either another person or they've harmed the family, the community, how they've hurt us in some way. But you can't have restorative justice without restorative practices. It's impossible, because most of it is I'm fixing something that I've harmed because I care. If I don't have the relationship, which is what restorative practices really focuses on, if I don't care, then it's really hard for me to try to fix it in a restorative way. Then you're just making me do something and I'm doing it so I can get away, you know, get out of whatever the issue is. So restorative practices is the 80%. That's what you have to do all the time, is building relationships, building trust, building communication, working on all of that, so that when something does go awry, you can implement these restorative practices, restorative justice practices, and they be effective. Is that okay?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's a really important point.
I have a question for you, Tanya. So you were talking about that engagement process. One of the things that I have a difficult time doing is when people are talking and expressing their feelings, their emotions, is kind of like wanting to interrupt and wanting to like not attack, but like address something. But when I let them finish and completely, I like forget half the things I want to say to talk about like the first talking point. So what kind of strategies do you have to like make sure you're fully engaged and make sure you're fully addressing some of their concerns and feelings and thoughts?
That's actually a very, very good question. If you're going to be sitting with someone and you intend on having that conversation, then paper and pen and asking, is it okay for me to write some things down? But oftentimes these things come up and we're not intending to have that conversation, right? So if things come up that you want to address at that particular moment, it might not be something you actually need to address. It might be that you're feeling something based on what they've said, and you want to address that feeling, not necessarily address what's the underlying issue. So you have to be able to differentiate the two, right? So the point of engagement is, yes, for you to get as much information as possible, but it's also for the other person to be able to freely express themselves. And you interrupting obviously isn't a good idea, but then you challenging or counterpointing, even if it's afterwards, can sometimes prevent them from feeling like they can freely express themselves the next time. So you have to be judicious on how often you do that and when you do that. Even if what they're saying is like, that's not what I know. That's not true. Because then it becomes, yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Even if you wait till the end. And is really that the issue? The issue is this person felt X. For whatever reason, that's the issue, not whether they really walked down the street and then made a left or not. So you have to really focus on the underlying issue. I don't know if I'm being as clear as I'm trying to be, but,
I think
Kibi, you were saying something?
Well, I mean, I think, Mr. King, Russell, I think it isn't easy. what you're trying to do. And I think it does take practice. And I think the process of listening and learning, in certain situations, what are the emotions you can anticipate yourself feeling, and recognizing that emotional impact, what it might be having on the topic at hand. It takes practice. So I don't think it's something that necessarily comes naturally to all of us. I mean, I did earlier say that I'm naturally restorative, but in situations that are challenging, it's hard, and it does take practice. And one of the things I really like about restorative is that it's a process. It's a practice and a process. So I think keep at it, and it's going to get easier.
Thank you.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, we can just sort of wrap up with just some closing thoughts if you want.
And I was going to say, Tanya, just to build on that, if there are some questions that didn't get answered or didn't get addressed tonight, from families who are present, please, reach out to Mr. King or Mr. Dara, or everybody's first name. I'm not sure if you go by first names or last names, but anyway, please reach out. And, if you thought you wish you'd asked a question and you didn't, there's always ways of either Tanya or myself getting back to you.
Yes. So I guess what I'd like to wrap up with is just, again, I tried to focus today on how you bring this to your home as a parent, because I do think it's an incredibly powerful parenting tool. It does require that, you have to be a little bit more introspective and think about how you're reacting to things. But once you start to the process and you realize that actually your kids will enjoy the process, I think it's so worth the journey. Like Hebe said, if you have any questions, please, you can send it to us and we'll be happy to help you. But it's an ongoing thing that once you create, it will be something that you'll never want to let go of in your family and in your household.
So I'll just close, but hopefully I don't have too much background noise. We are going to have one more session with Tanya. I can't remember the date. Feel free, somebody, to look in the calendar right now so we can tell people. And we're going to try to tailor it and hear back from our families about some of what they'd like to hear a second time. We also want to remind our families that we're going to have 2 sessions focused on special education with Chase Wesley, thinking about the summer, thinking about supporting our students with special needs this last part of the school year and into the summer. So that's also open to both our MMS and Seth Boyden communities. More info to come on that. Does anybody get a chance to see Tanya's next date that I don't have in my head?
3rd.
Oh, you know it, Tanya. Of course you do. When is it?
June 3rd.
June 3rd, same time. Thank you. So invite your friends. I know as a parent, this information is always a good reminder, especially during the COVID of it all and middle school of it all. Just thinking about ways to model what we want from our kids, and also make these home and school connections. Shannon or Sheila, did you want to say anything to close us out?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for your, the partnership with MMS. I'm excited. We're always sad to lose our 5th graders, but I think our partnership together with the parents and with restorative practices, we're setting them up for success, which is the most important thing. And we're giving them a voice, which is always one of our leading goals, and the ability to communicate with themselves in the world and their peers. So thank you so much, Tanya and Hebe. It's just been amazing. And I'm really looking forward to June. And, this is informative for me as a parent. And it's stuff that I have to continue to work on as a principal and as a parent. So just thank you so much for all of your help. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll be sharing the recording for those who couldn't make it. And everybody have a wonderful, wonderful night.